what's important, though, is what matters during an election campaign is what you as a party choose to highlight and prioritise, and does that align with the kind of concern of the majority of voters. So whatever the rights and wrongs of particular issues, you're making a statement as a party by the issues you choose to highlight. And I thought this morning when Kemi Badenoch was interviewed by Stig Abel on Times Radio, he asked her about social care, which is an incredibly important issue. She got really shirty and said, you've got me here under false pretenses, as if it was actually outrageous to ask her about a really important public policy issue that neither party actually have a proper answer on, because she wanted to talk about this narrow point of gender equality law.
And we say hello to Libby Purvis. Hello, Libby.
Hello.
And Rachel Sylvester's here in the studio. Hello, Rachel.
Morning, Matt.
So, the election's now, almost, is it 10 days? 10 days.
I think so,
10 days old. We've reached the sort of culture war stage. The Conservatives wading into the culture war today. Kemi Badenoch has accused sexual predators and activist campaign groups of abusing Britain's equality laws as she pledges to protect the privacy and dignity of women and girls by changing the Equality Act if the Conservatives win the election. She's been the Women and Equalities Minister for some time, but hasn't yet got around to doing it. Interestingly, and entirely separately, because we recorded it a few days ago, in today's exit interview, the former Conservative Minister and Conservative MP standing down, Robert Halfon, tells me why he thought this is the wrong direction for the Conservative campaign to take.
You leave all the cultural stuff to J.K. Rowling and others. I'm not saying it, I don't agree with it, I admire her hugely, but focus on what the public want. And the public want us to sort out the cost of living in the economy.
What do you think of this, Rachel? Is it right for the Conservatives to find points of difference with the Labour Party? And there clearly is one, because the Labour Party said explicitly they wouldn't do the same thing. Or is Rob Halfon right that actually fighting the culture wars is the wrong thing for the Tories at this point?
I think Rob Halfon's right, and he turned around his seat in Harlow, which he's now standing down from, by focusing on issues of concern to the voters. And people are worried about whether or not they can pay their bills, whether or not they can afford to go on holiday. They're worried about whether they can get a hospital appointment or a GP appointment, whether they can get a place at a good school for their kids. A tiny minority of people are worried about whether or not people can use bathrooms, or whether bathrooms should be single sex or whatever. And I think it's really ironic and fascinating that actually the Conservatives are now going down the rabbit hole that Labour and the sort of left have gone down in the past, in the search for a kind of ever-decreasing circle of votes. So it's almost as if, I think it's fascinating that it's almost as if the Tories are already behaving like the opposition, sort of throwing around policies left, right and centre. And Labour is looking sort of more and more like the government. Today, by contrast to Kemi Badenoch, Keir Starmer was making an announcement about Trident and national security. And the Tories, I think, the only way you can interpret this really is that they've sort of written off winning the election and they're just trying to shore up
the
their
base and
core
motivate.
vote. And it's not even, I mean, Ed Miliband had that sort of 35% strategy, didn't he, when he was Labour leader. This is, I think, a 25% strategy. They're trying to get their, Reform voters back or stop people voting for the Reform Party, rather than really trying to appeal to the broad range of voters who they'd need to win in a majority.
It's interesting, actually, Libby. So you've got Robert Halfon today saying, leave this to J.K. Rowling. J.K. Rowling has piled in today. She's been posting on Twitter. Kemi Badenoch and I might not agree on a lot, but she's coming out defence of her when people have criticised her. She says Alistair Campbell was being rude about Kemi Badenoch. J.K. Rowling said, thanks once again for highlighting Labour's complacency and indifference towards the rights of half the electorate. What do you make of this? Is it the right issue for the Tories to be fighting on now, Libby?
Well, a few days ago, I was writing furiously that they should all be concentrating on the absolute basics: public services, GPs, hospitals, police, transport, safe streets and parks, cost of living. But Kemi Badenoch is not wrong on her move, and it is not culture war. I think calling it culture war is just lazy. It is a safety issue she's talking about. She's talking about hospital wards, prisons and rape shelters. and defining what a woman is biologically in those places. I don't know. I mean, public lavatories obviously is a different question, and there's all sorts of things you can work around that, whether you should have a gender recognition issue and so on. But I don't call it a culture war. It's a safety issue.
But I suppose if it was so important and urgent, why has the government not already done it rather than?
Well, she's been at it for months.
Yeah.
Kemi Badenoch has been talking about it for months. I honestly do think it is something she is serious about, and I think it's interesting. And I think it would be a very good idea if Labour were to again add the word biological to the Equality Act. I think that wouldn't hurt either, especially where prisons and hospital wards are concerned and rape shelters.
I think what's important, though, is what matters during an election campaign is what you as a party choose to highlight and prioritise, and does that align with the kind of concern of the majority of voters. So whatever the rights and wrongs of particular issues, you're making a statement as a party by the issues you choose to highlight. And I thought this morning when Kemi Badenoch was interviewed by Stig Abel on Times Radio, he asked her about social care, which is an incredibly important issue. She got really shirty and said, you've got me here under false pretenses, as if it was actually outrageous to ask her about a really important public policy issue that neither party actually have a proper answer on, because she wanted to talk about this narrow point of gender equality law. As important as it is, it's about what are you kind of projecting to the public as the things that matter most to you as a party, and that creates an impression of. Oliver Letwin used to call it the aroma of a party. What's your aroma is what people vote on as much as individual policies.
And you talked about the fact that Conservatives are just as concerned about reform, perhaps more concerned about reform than Labour. Nigel Farage has said that at 4 o'clock today he is going to make an emergency general election announcement. Well, given that he'd originally said that he claimed that he was going to stand in a seat, but then when Rishi Sunak called the election, he decided not to because he didn't have time. But he wouldn't say where that seat was. Do you think he might yet throw his hat in the ring, Libby? We're sitting here on Monday morning, don't know what his emergency general election announcement is.
Oh, it's Coco the Clown stuff. I don't think we should be even talking about it. Let him make his announcement and then we'll talk about it. Announcing you're going to make an announcement is just, is he 12 or what? Heaven's sake.
In fact, the fact that he's announced he's making the announcement makes me think that it won't be as
much
big
of an announcement.
Because if he was actually going to want to surprise everyone when he was standing.
Yeah, he just wants as much attention as possible. Yeah. It's sort of, Libby's right, it's like the 12-year-old, me, miss.
All right, well, let's not give it to him. Libby, let's talk about your column today, because this story is absolutely fascinating. Bulgarians exploited the computer that said yes. So in all of the sort of swirl of the news over the last week or so, general election, obviously international news and everything, this story is absolutely extraordinary. For people who haven't come across it, just sum up for us what this story is all about.
Well, I was absolutely riveted by the fact that, they've now been brought to court and they've been jailed, and that is great, by the fact that a small group of Bulgarian criminals worked in an incredibly organised way to defraud the universal credit system, specifically the universal credit system. And they were incredibly organised. They had special filing cabinets, colour-coded. They had sort of claim packs and so on. They had a system for proving that somebody lived in a certain place because the DWP wanted evidence, and therefore you would take a photo of them outside the door, and the door had to be ajar, so they would Photoshop the door till it was ajar.
Amazing.
And they made over 50 million. And probably there is more to come, the law said. And the judge quite rightly observed that the DWP system for checking such things was woefully inadequate. They couldn't even identify ludicrously repeated use of the same name or address or telephone number. And what struck me reading about all this, they had letters from GPs that they forged and imaginary landlords. They invented children at schools. I thought the admin, the sheer bureaucratic brilliance of it, just shows that the whole system is set up to be very convenient for people who are a large group doing a very bureaucratically well organised sort of system with lots of burner phones and so on. And they're exactly the same qualities which make it incredibly difficult for individuals. They've changed the rules on universal credit yet again, only last month, something called the administrative earnings threshold changes. And so what it means is that intelligent, assiduous people who are really struggling but who are a bit confused and desperate and hungry and have to wait 5 weeks for the money are having incredible difficulty with the system as it is laid up, whereas international fraudsters are finding it incredibly easy to get through. It has all been set up the wrong way round. And I think we need to consider very carefully the use of IT in big things like this and the competence of the Department of Work and Pensions. I mean, it's a real scandal.
It's incredible, Rachel, that on the one hand, it's supposed to be made harder for people. You know, there's so many horror stories of genuine people in need struggling to navigate their way through the system. Whereas this essentially a criminal enterprise has cracked it.
Exactly. There were two things that struck me about this. The first one is how international crime now is. So it's very hard if you're sort of the local police force, wherever you are, to actually tackle these kinds of gangsters because they're based in multiple locations using multiple identities and so on. But the other thing is that the state has no way of really knowing who anyone is. So I think there is now a case for looking at some kind of ID system, whether that's digital or it doesn't need to be an ID card anymore, but some way of showing who someone is that links with a unique bank account that you can't get paid without this unique identifier, which is your access to state services. So it's not a kind of traditional ID card, your papers please. But if we want to tackle this kind of fraud, you have to be able to show who somebody is so that they can't repeatedly pretend to be somebody else.
It's so interesting the way that debate about ID cards really does seem to have shifted, Libby, because immigration is another classic example. I suppose it's all part of the same thing.
I've been banging on in favour of some form of ID card system for years now. I mean, I think it would help a great deal, the pull factor in immigration. But I mean, what struck me about all this was the fact that there's endless middle class whining about how, oh dear, it's so difficult to fill in your tax return. And you look at what is demanded of these poor devils who are just trying to get what the country has pledged to them, which is a minimum living standard. And do remember that half or over a third of people on universal credit are in work. I mean, this also suggests that low-level earnings are becoming morally inadequate in Britain, and we ask incredible complications of them, and yet the system is perfectly clear if you are, well-nourished, well-organised people with good filing cabinets. The whole thing just stinks.